Hi, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. So thank you very much for attending this webinar organized by the Center for Clean Air Policy, CCAP. CCAP has more than 35 years on the environmental sector. We were involved in the first discussion to develop the development mechanism. And now we used to work very closely with the local communities on development of carbon projects, and particularly with REDD projects. We have also involved in discussion for Article 6 and for social and environmental safeguards. And the idea of this webinar is to have like a constructive discussion on a topic that is affecting like the carbon markets and particularly like the confidence on REDD projects in Latin America, but also in other regions. From our point of view, we have identified that it's not possible to separate the discussion on the social aspect of carbon projects and also like the accounting, because in some way, like when as a buyer or as a developer, we want to create like a confidence on carbon market. We need to have like an integrity on projects on both sides. Something that has been happening during the last months is that every month or every 2 weeks we receive like a new article or like a press media or reports questioning like the estimate, like the carbon capture, the carbon reductions on REDD projects. And sometimes it's not easy to understand what is behind all those studies and how those studies are affecting the confidence on these markets. So for this reason, we have organized this webinar. First of all, like a keynote presentation from Tails West. So please, if you can move to the agenda. First, we are going to have like a presentation from Tails West. Tails is the author of one of the studies or the study recently published by Science magazine on overestimation of carbon capture. The idea is that Tails could explain a little bit what are like the main results, like what is the methodology behind this study. And then we have like a representative from BERA, from Centro Latinoamericano de Investigación Periodística, from CALIX, they're like a carbon rating agency, and from WWF, to have like a constructive discussion on how should we like analyze and consider those studies and how we could also contribute to increase like confidence on carbon markets. So to move in to the agenda, please, I'm going to present Tels. Tels is an assistant professor at the Institute for Environmental Studies at Virgin University in Amsterdam and fellow of the Center for Environmental Energy and Natural Resource Governance at the University of Cambridge. His research is focused on the sustainability of coupled human-natural system and topics like land use cover, resource management, environmental economics, and the topic that is of interest for today, like carbon offsets and REDD projects. So welcome, Tails.
Hi, Dad, you're muted. Tails, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. Very excited to be here to talk to you about our recent study on the voluntary REDD+ projects and the implications of our findings for REDD+ and for the carbon market as well. I do have the slides, my slides here, and okay, I guess I can share them now. All right, can you see my slides? I trust that you can see them. If you can't, let me know.
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. Perfect. Wonderful, wonderful. So I thought we could start this talk today by covering the basics, right? And whoops, So you might have seen something like this before, right? You're buying a flight ticket and you're asked if you want to spend some extra money to offset the emissions of your flight. If you choose to do so, what you're actually doing, perhaps even without knowing, is buying some carbon offsets, right? Most of these offsets, or a lot of them, they come from projects that are trying to avoid deforestation. Some of them are trying to promote reforestation. Roughly speaking, each time one of these projects avoid the emission or remove 1 ton of CO2 from the atmosphere, they can generate one offset, right? So in theory, you should feel good about promoting these types of projects and offsets. If you choose to do so, you wouldn't be alone. These offsets are the basis of a $2 billion market expected to grow substantially in the near future, right? But there's a problem here. There's no evidence that these carbon offsets actually work. And you may have seen this recent article by The Guardian stating that more than 9% of the offsets are essentially worthless. This story here that story was based on these 3 studies, which in turn, they are all based on causal inference analysis, and you can see the methods that were used listed here. And the whole discussion about carbon offsets became even more popular after our preprint from January was officially published in Science a couple of months ago, right? That's why we are here today. Anyway, the causal inference methods that were used in this science study and also in the previous studies are used to rigorously evaluate the impact or the performance of any type of intervention. And of course, in this case, we use them to look at the voluntary REDD+ projects, right? To check if they were working or not. And these are well-established and accepted methods. In fact, some of the people that developed some of the methods that we used recently won the Nobel Prize for their work. And you can see them here. Now I'll talk more about causal inference methods, but first let's talk about the voluntary REDD+ projects that again were the focus of the science study. Right, so I guess I don't have to tell you this, but REDD+ stands for Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. The plus involves the role of conservation, sustainable forest management, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. And it is essentially a performance-based, carbon-based payment for environmental services, right? You may also know that REDD+ can also exist within a spectrum, if you will. So just to make sure we are all on the same page, we can have a more centralized version of REDD+, where we would be talking about national programs, subnational jurisdictions, right? Usually associated with actual laws and regulations from the government. And on the other end of the spectrum, we could have a more decentralized version of REDD+. Here we would be talking about voluntary activities, project-based, usually unregulated by governments, and usually activities that seek some sort of certification. Vera, or the VCS, is the main certification scheme today. You must know that already. And well, today we're going to be focusing most of my presentation, at least, on these types of projects, right? So let's just see how these types of interventions, how they work. Okay. And let's focus on the ones that are trying to avoid deforestation or unplanned deforestation. All right. So here in the corner, we have a satellite image of an actual project area. This one is located in DRC, Africa. And the way that these projects usually start is that you have a project area with some forest. You expect that in the absence of the project, you would see some deforestation, right? That's your baseline scenario. With the project, you expect to see no or simply less deforestation due to the project itself. We could call that the project scenario. And we can simply measure the difference between these two scenarios. That's from where this idea of additionality comes from, right? And we can measure that difference through time following the example of the red arrows here. And they essentially illustrate how offsets are issued, all right? That's roughly how this works. Something that is important to keep in mind is that while the project scenario is observable, the baseline scenario is not. We can only simulate it. So we could have a baseline scenario that looks like this, but we could also have a baseline scenario that looks like that. And the baseline scenario, and this is important, directly affects the number of offsets a project generates. Okay, so keep this in mind. Now let's talk a bit about causal inference. And let's use this example from the Brazilian Amazon. Okay, so in 2004, the government launched this policy to reduce deforestation, and we can actually see a significant reduction here in deforestation, right? Which suggests that the policy was effective. Well, we also can see that there was a significant decline in agricultural commodity prices after 2004, which are known to affect deforestation rate, right? That is known as a confounding factor, and that's actually quite important. And the point here is that for us to be able to estimate the effect of the Brazilian policy on deforestation, we need to control for confounding factors. So keep that in mind, right? So now let's assume that we want to create a baseline or a counterfactual to measure the policy impact. Okay, one thing we could do is to create a simple baseline based on the average deforestation we observed before the project, the policy was implemented, and extrapolate that into the future, right? And we can use that to estimate how many offsets the Brazilian government could claim for implementing the zero deforestation project or a policy. Now, we already know that this is problematic, right? So alternatively, we could create a baseline that does account for confounding factors. And then based on this new baseline, well, this is how many offsets should be claimed by the Brazilian government, implying that had we used the other baseline, right, this volume of offsets that are not real, or in other words, they are not additional, they would have been issued anyway. And the real problem with ignoring the idea that additionality implies causation is that hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations and individuals out there are using these offsets to offset their own emissions. And Disney here is just one example of them. You can see that Disney's emissions are going down. Well, actually, not really. The net emissions are going down because they're using carbon offsets. Their actual emissions have never been higher. And the point here is that for the offset mechanism to work, offsets need to be real. We need to measure additionality properly. We need credible baselines, right? Okay, so here's what we did in our recent science study to check if the voluntary REDD+ projects actually have credible baselines. We looked at a number of VCS certified projects around the world aimed at reducing unplanned deforestation. You can see them in red in the figure. And we used the causal inference method to construct a credible baseline scenario for each of those project areas. So in a nutshell, for each project, we looked at a number of potential control areas, areas without projects, and we combined them in order to create something we call a synthetic control, which is an area that doesn't really exist, but can still be observed because it is based on areas that do exist, okay? And the advantage of doing that is that we can have synthetic controls that are very similar to the project areas, in the sense that we can use them to create credible baseline scenarios that do account for confounding factors. Okay. Now, just to illustrate what we did, here you can see the location of the potential control areas we used to construct a synthetic control for this project area from DRC. This is the same project area I just showed you. Anyway, so what happens when we compare our synthetic control baselines with the project's official baselines? Right, that's what we have in the figure here. We're looking at deforestation through time. Each panel corresponds to a unique project. The black dashed line is when the project started. And then in blue, we have the baselines from the synthetic controls, and in orange, the official project baselines, right? Now you can see that almost always the project baseline is much higher than the synthetic control baseline. And well, what is the implication of that? If we combine all these projects, according to their own official baselines, they should have been allowed to issue up to 9 million offsets by 2020. Okay, that's an estimate. However, when we looked at the synthetic control baselines, well, we see that only 6% of those 9 million offsets would likely represent actual carbon emission reductions. Okay, and that's, of course, a bit of a problem, isn't it? Okay, so naturally, one of the questions that come to mind is why such large differences between these two types of baselines? And to really answer that, we need to look at the way these projects create their baselines, which is by following one of these methodologies here approved by the VCS. Okay, so let's just quickly see how baselines are created according to these methodologies. Starting with VM6, right, we have a project area, a reference region, and an overall deforestation equation, okay, which is based on the historical deforestation observed inside the reference region. So the deforestation enters this equation either as an average or as a forecast from a regression model, which, and this is really key, is proportionally applied to the project area. Okay, and then we have, on top of that, we have a discount factor that makes the baseline more conservative. But overall, we have very strong assumptions here. And these are the historical deforestation trends will continue into the future. So there's no attempt to control for confounding factors here. And the reference region is a good reference for the project area. Okay. Now, VM9 is similar to VM6, right? But the historical deforestation from the reference region is used to fit a logistic regression, which is then used to forecast the baseline deforestation for the project area, okay? Now, if you have experience with logistic regressions, you may know that they could potentially lead to an artificial explosion in deforestation during the initial years of the project. And that is simply because of the functional form of this equation, okay? Anyway, on top of that, in VM9, we don't have any discounts applied to the baseline. And again, the same strong assumptions we had for VM6, we also have for VM9, okay. Now we can talk about VM7 and 15 together because they're essentially very similar when it comes to creating baselines. And by the way, these are by far the most popular methodologies out there. So again, we have a historical average or a forecast from a regression model, but unlike VM6 or 9, the rate of deforestation is not proportionally applied to the project area, but it is allocated across a reference region using a spatial simulation model. Okay, so maps are created. So you could, for example, have a baseline map that looks like this. And in this case, no deforestation was allocated inside the project area. So the baseline deforestation is 0. This project would issue no carbon offsets. We could also have a very different baseline map that looks like this, right? And in this case, deforestation was allocated inside the project area. The baseline deforestation in this case is 100%, so this project would be able to issue a lot of carbon offsets. So you could end up in a situation where you need to choose between very different baseline maps. And how do you choose them? Well, the reality is that with high flexibility, lack of transparency, and poor model validation requirements from these methodologies, experienced modelers can create almost any baseline map they want. And this point has been made before by many experts, including Professor Soares Filho here, who is a top land use change modeler in the world. He developed this model called Dynamica Eagle, which, by the way, is used by many project developers to create the baseline maps we were just talking about. And here's what Professor Soares Filho has to say about it. Okay. When I saw those people using our models in their projects, I saw that I was part of this mess. I have a responsibility to demystify the system. Vera has validated credits using disgraced methodologies. Those credits are mostly hot air. All right. Now, just to illustrate the point, let me show you what happens when we apply all those different methodologies to construct baselines for this project area here that I kept showing to you since the beginning of the presentation. All right, so this is what happens. Again, we're looking at deforestation over time. The project starts after the black dashed line. And then, well, we have a number of different lines inside the blue area. Each one of them represents the baseline from a different methodology. And we can see that these lines, they go all over the place. And that is a problem, of course. Now, keep in mind that in theory, this project could have adopted any of these baselines that you see here as its official project baseline. And again, we go back to the previous point that without credible baselines, we cannot properly measure additionality, okay? Now, the results I showed you so far, they are all based on one of the methods that we used in the science paper. We also used 2 other causal inference methods. Here we have the results from the generalized synthetic control method, which has a similar name to the previous method, but it's actually fundamentally different. But anyway, we don't have time to go over the details here, so I'm just gonna tell you that what we find from this analysis is that the projects are not having a significant impact at reducing deforestation, meaning the reductions associated, and here we're looking at groups of projects, but anyway, the reductions in deforestation associated with these groups of projects are not necessarily different from 0. But even if we assume that they're different from 0, the reductions that we estimate, they're still much smaller than claimed by the projects. We find a similar result with this other method that we also used in the paper. Again, I'm not going to focus a lot on it because I'm running out of time. I just want to call the attention that while there are only a few other serious studies out there on this topic, this is one of them. These studies also point to the same conclusions. This one in particular says that our results using DID matching cannot reject the impact that the REDD+ project is rather small, if not no. This is another example. This is from a report from Calyx Global. They are a project and offset rating company. Deborah Lawrence is here with us, and she can talk more about their work. But the point here is that they are also raising some serious concerns about the REDD+ project baselines. And I also know that there are other rating companies out there also raising similar serious concerns about the projects. Okay, so all of that to say that it's not just our science paper that is questioning the credibility of the REDD+ offsets, all right? Anyway, if you want to learn more about REDD+ projects, you can check out this recent report from UC Berkeley. It's a 200-page report, and it covers many different issues with this project, from baselines to social safeguards. Highly recommended. If you're interested in learning more about offsets, but you don't want to read a 200-page report, this is also a very interesting podcast episode that you can listen to. They emphasize this issue of double counting, which is very important, but it's something that we did not cover in our science paper. And just before I conclude this presentation, let's just go back and talk a bit about jurisdictional REDD+, right? So you might be aware that there are certification schemes for REDD+ jurisdictions right now. I mean, at least they're being promoted quite extensively nowadays. The most prominent examples would be the ART3 standard and the various jurisdictional and nested REDD+ program. Now, the baseline issues we've talked about so far, they also apply to jurisdictions, and that's the point that I wanted to make. Essentially, this is how the ART3 standard wants baselines to be designed. So you look at a reference period of 5 years, you calculate an average, you extrapolate that average into the future. Various approaches is similar, but it's spatially explicit. So it's actually more similar to VM7 and 15. The difference is that instead of using a project reference region, this approach uses a jurisdictional region. But again, under both approaches that are currently being promoted, there's no attempt to control for confounding factors. And if the framework ignores confounding factors, it cannot reliably measure, and hence it doesn't, sorry about the typo here, but it cannot be used to estimate the additionality, and it doesn't work for carbon offsetting. That's the point, right? And it goes back to the issue we've already discussed. Offsets, they need to be real. They need to be additional if the goal is to sell them to organizations like Disney, who will use them to offset their emissions. Okay, now just some quick recommendations for high integrity REDD+ offsets. It's obvious that we need new baseline methodologies. We need to think outside the box. We cannot ignore confounding factors. That is causal inference 101. Related to the first point, we need to follow good scientific practices, and why not seek feedback from real experts and academics. And finally, at the very least, we need to increase the transparency associated with this project, right? Today, we talked a lot about baselines, but at the beginning, Sebastian was talking about more of the social aspects of these projects. Oftentimes, these projects are promoted as very important projects for local communities, but we don't actually know the impacts of the projects on local communities, right? In terms of benefit sharing, for example, we have no idea how much of the revenues from these projects are actually reaching the local communities. Is it 95% of the revenues, or is it 5% of the revenues, right? We simply don't know that information. It's not publicly available, and having that information available could actually help us to understand why some of these projects are performing better or worse than the others. Okay, so this is, apologize, I used more time than I should. This is all that I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tels. I think it's like a very, very interesting discussion. Now, I would like to invite, like, I mean, in case that you have questions for Tels, I will ask you the favor to include like those questions in the Q&A or preguntas y respuestas option in Teams, so we can have those questions at the end of the panel session. So now I would like to invite the panelists. So Naomi, Andres, Martin, and Deborah. Okay, so Naomi, I think it's we really appreciate like your interest to take part in this webinar. Naomi is Senior Director for REDD Program Development and Innovation at Vera. She's responsible for co-leading on the release of Vera's new consolidated REDD methodology. She's also focusing on the development and implementation of a long-term strategy for Vera REDD program that meets the high integrity needs of the market. Previously, she has worked with the major Global Conservation Foundation and carbon project developers. She has also held various leadership positions at Vera in the past, including Chief Program Officer and Chief Market Development Officer. So thank you very much. We also have like Andres Liébano. He's a journalist and an editor at the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism, CLIP, which fosters cross-border collaborative investigation in the region. Deborah Lawrence. Deborah leads the scientific integrity of Calyx Global Greenhouse Gas Rating, managed research and analytics for nature-based solutions. She is also an environmental science professor at the University of Virginia, where she conducts global forest and climate research. She received a bachelor in anthropology from Harvard University and a PhD in botany from Duke University. Deborah's favorite activities includes tending her climate-forward backyard, where she must constantly defend her beloved chicken from boxes. Thanks, man. And finally, we have like also Martin. Martin was pretty like a carbon market coordinator at Zika, but now he's working with a WWF, where he is director of Forest Climate Solution Impact and Monitoring. In his role, he oversees the technical design of projects and initiatives in varying forest geographies to guarantee quantifiable forest climate impact. His work experience is focused on climate action with public and private international cooperation initiatives, research on ecosystem services, and policy design in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Panama, US, and the Asia Pacific region. So thank you very much for all the panelists to attend this invitation. So in order to have like a constructive discussion, first I would like to ask Noemi that, considering Tell's presentation and probably also like the results of his study published in Science that you I understand you have already replayed. Could you explain in an easy and understand language what is the main difference between the synthetic control methodology proposed by Tels in his study and the methodology normally used by Vera for the estimation of emission reduction of REDD projects, and why there is like a significant difference between the results of both methodological approaches, that we're talking about like around 90% of difference between both? So please.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this webinar. I think before I can answer that question, we need to take a step back and remind ourselves a bit how the voluntary carbon market came to be, what it was designed for, and what it was like for some of these projects as they were being the first to be established. So to provide some of that context and then to dive back into the methods, the voluntary carbon market was designed to allow companies to go beyond regulation and to find innovative ways to reduce emissions globally. It was really designed to test new ideas and to bring finance to critical mitigation. And it was also designed to self-correct over time. So the standards and processes for the development and evolution of those is designed to incorporate lessons learned and improvements in the science and data. So for example, these projects are required to update their baselines every 10 years, which we have now shortened to every 6. So there is a mechanism for incorporating ongoing improvements to these really innovative approaches. And if we go back to the early days of this market, Vera, VCS at the time, convened the leading scientists in forestry and agriculture, people like Sandra Brown, one of the preeminent foresters, and Keith Poushin on the agriculture side, as well as many others, to design a new mechanism that would allow for the accounting and crediting of these activities, and allowed for innovation in terms of the methodology design itself. Those methodologies underwent public consultation, they underwent peer review, they underwent a double audit by validators before then being applied to project activities and validated and verified in that context. To design a project at that time was to be the first to ever do this with a new concept in a new market. There was no finance available at a large scale. There were incredibly risky investments. And when we're talking about back in 2009 to 2012, when some of the beginning of these projects were being established, the only data available is largely, in terms of remote sensing, Landsat data, which is 30-meter resolution. Oftentimes it was requiring sourcing of images for multiple years in order to get complete images because of cloud cover and other challenges like that. It certainly wasn't possible to pick dozens of control points across the jurisdiction where it would be possible to get clear images on a daily basis like you can now. At the time as well, carbon prices were low, a few dollars a ton, and these projects were essentially scraped together on a dream that we could use private finance to protect the world's forests, which we're losing and continue to lose at a rate that will devastate humanity if we don't figure out a way to stop it. The communities involved also took a risk. Many of them didn't have clear land tenure, and many of the early projects worked for years to secure legal rights, which was a huge benefit to local communities, and ensure that they were able to benefit from protecting instead of cutting down their forests, as many were being offered in terms of alternatives from palm oil and the like. So these baselines were constructed based on sound scientific thinking at the time, considering the rates and patterns of deforestation seen in similar areas of the country where deforestation had already occurred, and trying to stop that before it happened in the project area. And this is a point that I'll come back with and is important. In other words, the logic of these projects, with the patterns seen in the historical period in the reference area, would then later play out in a similar way in the project. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. So what has happened over the last 10 years? How do we get to the methods that we have and the methods that you're seeing today? So over the last decade, more than a decade really at this point, data availability and resolution has increased exponentially. We now have tools that were not available at the time in order to look at this, and there was no comparison that could be done historically because these were brand new efforts. And one of the big learnings that we have had, and I think that you're seeing here, but is also something quite relevant to the approach being taken, is that reference regions are very difficult to match appropriately. It can be difficult to find good parallels to similar areas of the project, particularly when you take into account the drivers of deforestation, the forest and ecosystem types, the access to markets, the distance to roads and communities and pressures, and the legal and policy context, which are all really essential to being able to find a good comparison area. The other big evolution is the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was signed, meaning that countries now have specific targets that they need to meet, and that accounting at anything less than the national level needs to be harmonized at the national level. Verra started working on a new mechanism that was also referenced in terms of the jurisdictional and nested REDD, beginning around 2012. Later, FCPF and ART-trees have developed those similar mechanisms. The rules and requirements of those are around 98 to 99% the same. So they're more or less very similar structures for jurisdictional accounting. As we began implementing, it became, and collaborating with jurisdictions on testing JNR, it became clear that the way that nesting had been proposed there, which is essentially deducting project issuances from project methodologies from jurisdictional accounting, wasn't adequate to ensuring alignment with the national accounting approach. So back in 2019, Verra began to rethink how to establish project baselines, again, drawing on many experts in the field, science and research and applied experts, to figure out how to establish project baselines in a way that would support and align with national programs. And this is really critical. Ensuring that harmonization with national accounting is now essential in terms of supporting national REDD+ programs and in aligning with the accounting that those countries are doing in the context of the Paris Agreement. So the approach that we take in our new methodology, which will be released in a matter of weeks, is essentially using the overall deforestation in the country as the starting point and allocating that down based on where deforestation is likely to occur, given its distance to historical deforestation, and a number of other factors can also be included in that. which will ensure that all the activities in a jurisdiction add up. In other words, they can't, that deforestation at the jurisdictional level essentially becomes a cap on what can be allocated around the jurisdiction. So on a national basis, on a global basis, accuracy and conservativeness is improved, which is a different question than that being asked by the methods that are bottom-up or project-based. So to come back to a comparison of the old methodologies, our old methodologies, which were bottom-up, or the existing ones, the synthetic control approach, and our new methods. So as mentioned before, the original logic of these projects was looking at the observed deforestation in a period of time prior to the implementation of the project, and assuming that a similar pattern would play out in the project area. So there is a time lag there. In other words, there was not an intention for this to concurrently analyze reference areas in the project area. Deforestation is well documented in the literature to follow an S curve. In other words, generally speaking, especially when we're talking about unplanned deforestation, it begins slowly, it speeds up when the forest becomes more accessible, and then it slows down when, for example, most of the high value timber has been extracted. So the logic of those projects in the early methodologies was essentially that you had already seen this pattern play out in a reference area, it would then subsequently play out in a project area. So if you're comparing rather concurrently the project area and a bunch of control points, you are looking at a different set of logic for evaluating those projects. So right or wrong, it is a different timescale, and that is one of the reasons why we see differences in some of those results. The second part is that, again, as mentioned, one of the biggest lessons learned is the difficulty of selecting and validating an appropriate reference area. The synthetic controls essentially face the same problem and then some, because you're using many, many more. So these forest areas, many of them are quite unique when you combine the threat, the ecosystem, the access to markets, the policy constraints. Finding one comparative area is very difficult, let alone dozens, and the way that those are weighted can also lead to potential bias. And as far as I can understand from the work that you have done yourself, this approach does not necessarily take into account many of these factors that make sure that those areas actually match in terms of the threat of deforestation, which may be underestimating the estimate of what would have occurred in those project areas without the project. So there are a number of other efforts underway at the moment to attempt to recreate this study. And one of the things that they are already finding is that the parameterization of the control points greatly affects the results and can lead to entirely different conclusions for the projects. Many of those points then that are used are likely falsely equivalent to the project areas, and those studies will be published hopefully soon. They are working to finalize those now. There's a number of other areas, technically speaking, that we would debate some of that, but I don't have time to go into all the detail. What I want to come back is, though, at the end of the day, we do agree that there are areas for improvement within this whole framework. And we have been working on those updates for several years. And as I mentioned before, the new methodology is imminent. It'll be out in a matter of weeks. So that methodology, as noted, takes a top-down approach, which is a different logic. The benefit, again, is making sure that there is consistency with the Paris Agreement, with national accounting and reporting. At the end of the day, there's no evidence that this approach, the synthetic controls, is in fact any more accurate per se for any project location than the old methodologies or the new approach. In reality, there are a number of different approaches being used right now by ratings agencies who each are using slightly different methods, some that are more similar to the synthetic control, some that are more similar to our new methodology. And yet the results across these are often different, even for the same project. So as you mentioned, these projects are essentially a counterfactual. You're trying to stop the deforestation before it starts, and you're trying to estimate something compared to a future that doesn't actually play out. What we do know is that we must stop deforestation before it starts. So this approach essentially faces one of the same problems as our original methodologies, the accuracy entirely dependent on the selection of the comparison areas, which is also open, potentially to errors or bias, and can be complex if we want to find areas that are actually comparable to the pressures faced by those forests. So we do again, agree there is a need to shift in methods. There is more data available. There is more information on approaches. And so what we are looking to do right now is undertake a new research collaboration. And we've announced this in New York at Climate Week. More details are forthcoming soon. Which is essentially going to do a comparison of these different methods and attempt to actually answer the question of which is actually more accurate in what cases. And just to give an example, even this approach really won't work in some situations. If you look at mangroves, for example, the extent of remaining mangroves is such in many countries that there are simply not enough control areas left, or even potentially reference areas left. And the entire ecosystems, need to be protected. So those will require a different approach to baselining than we might see in general of unplanned deforestation playing out across the country. So we need to make sure that we're using the right methods for the right dynamics. So we're looking at undertaking this comparative approach that tries to answer the question of what really are the best, most accurate methods that can be used in different situations. We're also looking at assessing the overall sustainable development impact of these projects and having a better response on that. We are looking at how we can use these comparative methods potentially as a form of a true-up mechanism going forward, recognizing that, again, these are all attempts to predict a future that will not play out. And by looking at more than one, we may be able to get an overall more accurate picture. So we are looking into that. FARA has also been extensively working on the issue of transparency, digitizing our methodologies, digitizing the project data so that all of it will be much more accessible going forward. And at the end of the day, we welcome this dialogue. We welcome how to improve the sector. We also have to make sure that this finance continues to flow to forest protection. And we can't wait for regulation that doesn't yet exist. And we can't let companies off the hook to not account and pay for their footprint on the way to net zero. And currently, carbon markets remain the only viable way to pay for an otherwise non-revenue generating activity that is essential to the survival of all of us on this planet. I think at the end of the day, we could also go into debating how these ultimately get used by companies, and that's another topic for another day. But thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Now, I think it's very important to know all the background on how the methodology have been evolving, and also like the improvements that you are considered to include for REDD methodologies and also for the BCS program. Naomi, I know that you are facing some problem with the batteries. So before to jump into the other panelists, I will have to ask another question to you that I think you already mentioned, and it's about like the update that you are considering for the REDD project methodologies in Vera. You explained briefly what you are considering, but my second question is, in the case that those new methodologies represent like a less reductions for the projects, have you considered to apply like a retroactive analysis to projects that have been already certified? I mean, if you have like a project from 5 years ago or something like that, you are considered to repeat like those new methodologies for those existing projects?
We are considering ways to facilitate something along those lines, but I'm not ready to fully answer exactly how that's going to play out. I think one of the things that's critical to understand from a standards perspective is that standards set out the rules of the game, and they set out policies, and they set out expectations in terms of when and how things will change. It's very, very difficult to go back and retroactively change a rule. It would violate the rules that had been set out and the commitments that were made from the standard at the beginning, and could potentially result in legal issues. So we are working on a way of potentially looking back, but there are challenges to how that might be implemented and applied. And I think at the same time, there are opportunities. We're all aware of the ICVCM's work to establish a set of core carbon principles. We anticipate that our new methodology will meet them. So one opportunity may involve being able to retroactively apply the new methodology to old vintages where there are unsold units as a way of facilitating access. But that is also something still under discussion in terms of how to implement.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Naomi. Okay, my next question is for Deborah. I mean, considering that your organization was mentioned in the presentation from TALES, and also from my previous experience as a carbon buyer, like a rating agencies have emerged as an additional mechanism to reduce potential integrity risk in the purchase of carbon credits. Yes. However, there are differences in the methodology used by different carbon rating agencies, also by like the academia, as the study presented by TELS, and also like by carbon standards. So it makes even more complex to have like a buying decision or trading decision of carbon credits. From your point of view, and considering like the multiple sources of information and methodologies for evaluating the quality of REDD projects, what do you consider should be like the approach for evaluating those credits when you need to make a decision or buying or not like a particular project?
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. It was great to hear Thales's his presentation and the response from Vera. It made me think all sorts of things. It was really great. I would like to talk a little bit about first this idea that all the different ratings agencies get different answers. I would say, let me just answer your question quickly before I'll preview what else I'd like to discuss. I think that buyers should be taking as much information as they can. They should take information from ratings agencies. They should take information from academics if they have access to that literature. Certainly, we should be appreciative when the academics share it with us. When they share what they've learned about specific projects, I would certainly take that on. And I would say, gather as much information as you can, and have a healthy skepticism about what comes straight out of the registry or from the standards, because as was noted, it's just a minimum bar. A standard provides a minimum bar, and because it was all evolving when things were in flux and there was a lot of interest in encouraging these activities, there was not, you couldn't see ahead what was going to be the problem. How was it going to be gamed? How would people take advantage? We couldn't see that like 10, 15 years ago. I would argue that some of it could have been foreseen. I never like the argument that it's just about the new tools we have. I think remote sensing has been great for quite a long time, and 30-meter resolution is adequate for a lot of what we see. It's like you do not have to have really excellent tools to see the difference between an assumption that says deforestation is going to have a jump change from today, like it's going to increase 10 times from today. You could judge that whether or not you have really good remote sensing data. So I think a lot of the information it's not crazy to do a better job with the information that was had. I would also say that what we find in our analysis is that projects sometimes take years to come to market, and they are, they say they're starting in 2015, they submit their documents in 2019. They've had 4 years to kind of judge how good their baseline is. So there is a moment to actually consider what you might have learned from the data that's coming out. So that's one possibility, is just to simply take a look and see how it's going. That's before the actual validation. And then finally, I would say that we, without knowing anything about Thales and his colleagues' work, we came to a very similar conclusion with approaches that are similar to what Vera is proposing for the future. So the proposed methodology is basically a backwards look with some help looking forwards. It doesn't take care of all the confounding factors of changes in the market or broader policy changes, but it's a close look back for a close look forward. And we had the same conclusion that many projects were taking a very different and much more aggressive approach that we did not think was realistic. It's occurred to me that one fundamental issue that's not always discussed is the idea of a 30-year project. And we do tend to focus on the immediate future, like what's the credit worth right now? What is happening right now? What is avoided right now? And that's hard because in 30 years, a project that looks pretty protected right now may not be so protected. And if you don't start protecting it now, how do you protect it 30 years from now? Like, I get that that's problematic. So I feel like we have to both anticipate the long future and acknowledge that right now the threat may be far less than is sometimes used when setting the baseline. So get lots of information, be conservative, and demand transparency from the standard and from projects so that we can just do our best job of looking at what's been done. I will say, I'll finish with saying I'm pretty excited about the new methodology. I think it goes a lot further than we've had in the past. I think it's going to do a lot to improve the integrity of REDD credits. And I love the idea of the look back. I would also remind everyone that for at least one of them, I believe it's VM9, there is a look back mechanism. And so I believe for VM9 projects that's already built in, and it's possible that Vera could take that on as well. Thanks so much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Deborah. Okay, so my next question is for Martin, that we have already like had an internal discussion on this, and also how it is impacting like the carbon market for REDD projects in Latin America. Martin, so considering that the questioning of baselines and estimates of carbon reduction for REDD projects have become increasingly frequently in the media and also in the academia, and that also having like a negative impact on market confidence for REDD project. What recommendations do you have to strengthen the scientific discussion around like the reduction and baseline for REDD projects, and how this could improve to how could this contribute to improve the confidence on the carbon market?
Thank you, Sebastian. So before enter to describe my opinions about how we could improve or avoid reputational negative impacts in the carbon markets, accordingly, the synthetic controls methods and analysis and alternative ways to measure the quality of the results, mainly in the forestry sectors. I want to mention that reputational issues that the carbon market are facing are going beyond that the quality questions that the studies as the Westdales put today and presented today. So also we need to recognize, and he mentioned at the end of his presentation, that is interesting also in focus the research approaches in transparency issues and in benefit sharing. And I am opening this intervention with this comment because we could solve all the quality issues that the carbon market is facing and including new tools. But if we don't put the communities in the center and we don't also create agendas to solve the other reputational problems, we will have a middle and not complete answer to this to try to improve all the aspects of the markets. Regarding the quality and the use of the synthetic control methods, I think the presentation of the Professor Tales was very complete. And we have two ways to follow according to this study and all the scientific movement that is researching the quality of the credits. And one is just maintain and continue doing and measuring the baselines as we are doing until this moment. And secondly, we could try to create tools to use the synthetic control methods in the validation and verification processes and in the design of the baselines. I think this second takeaway is the answer that we should follow it. We should put during the next months or efforts as independent big NGOs and also all the think tanks that are interested in improve the markets and create operational steps to implement this kind of methods to complement the way that we are following to demonstrate additionality and to create baselines. But I want to highlight too that there is in the synthetic controls, there is not an universal answer because it is still not clear. It's totally clear how it could be implemented at project level, but it is not totally clear how we could use this tool to measure, for example, at jurisdictional level results. This is a technical question that we could try to answer. What is the use of this kind of methodologies in jurisdictional level? And also, don't forget the other REDD activities. So it's clear that it's feasible to implement this kind of approaches to measure or to create alternative tools to measure the additionality in deforestation. But when you try to implement these kind of approaches in degradation, the activity data don't allow the implementation of the same approach, because you will have less opportunity to create the synthetic areas and to find comparable areas to develop the studies. And in the case of removals and forest management, is not precedent to implement this kind of approaches. So in general, I am seeing that we are facing the opportunity to create new tools. Let's go to do and put more work in building. And I am very happy also to hear the Naomi from Berra's interventions, because I felt that the carbon standard are hearing what is happening, and the new advances that became from the scientific world. So, but we need to move quickly to create the methodologies and the specific steps to implement this kind of new approaches.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Martina. And I would like to highlight that, like, one of the issues that it is important to do not disconnect, like, the social impact with the environmental impact, or the quality accounting of REDD projects. And for this, I would like to invite our next panelist, that is Andres Bermudez. And like, the reason also to have here Andres is that as we are operating in an unregulated market, I think the media has played a key role on improving confidence, or like or to highlight some red flags for REDD projects on environmental and social aspects. So based on that, Andres, if maybe you can mention from your experience, what I mean, what are like the main findings that you have identified, like analyzing like a REDD project? I know they have like elaborate different reports on REDD projects, particularly for Colombia.
Thank you, Sebastian, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here. Well, I wanted to begin with, by saying I am, of course, a journalist, and we have approached this subject from a journalistic perspective. And I also want to say I do believe in the carbon market's potential, linking companies interested in offsetting their fossil fuel use with communities that are caring for strategic ecosystems to mitigate climate change. But this win-win situation on paper, what we have seen at the Latin American Center for Investigative Journalism is there are a lot of problems in real life. We have so far written 8 in-depth investigations into cases in Colombia's carbon credit market, beginning with one that actually appeared on Sales' West map. Colombia's largest carbon project, we found, has been probably overclaiming its environmental results for a number of years. It's a project certified by Vera. You could see it on the eastern side of Colombia in Sales' map. And what we found in partnership with Carbon Market Watch is that this project was using for a certain time a deforestation baseline that is 5 times higher than the one that Colombia officially submitted to the UN FCCC for the Amazon biome, which is where the project is located. And we basically identified 3 key differences between the project area and the reference area. Several of you mentioned that. We looked at this from a journalistic perspective, not an academic one or a scientific one, but we found 3 major differences that for us were a sign of alarm. We saw that there were 3 deforestation hotspots of the 8 largest one in Colombia. 3 of them were located in the reference area, but there was absolutely none of them, not even close to where the project area was. So you can see from that the project area was much less exposed to deforestation trends than the reference area. We also saw major differences in road access, whereas the Mataben Reservation, which is the name of the project, is located in an area of the country with absolutely zero roads. The reference area that was chosen had hundreds of them, and that obviously has a very different scenario in terms of risks. And similarly, we found major differences in land tenure, whereas in one case we have an indigenous reservation or indigenous territory that is constitutionally protected and has very, very limited, a lot of limitations on the way land can be used and the permits that you need for certain uses. The other one was a mishmash of very different land tenure figures that obviously, made it very difficult to compare in a country where scientific studies have shown that it is much less likely to have deforestation inside an indigenous reservation than outside. So this has other implications as well, because Colombia also has a jurisdictional approach in the Amazon. So you had problems of double counting, et cetera, and a loss of tax revenue because we have a carbon tax and offsets are used to avoid paying the carbon tax. But additionally, and this is another thing I wanted to say, we have found many problems in regarding the relationship between projects and local communities that host them. First of all, we have found a number of problems in specific REDD projects. We have found communities that have been insufficiently or partially consulted, with one extreme case of almost no one in the community knowing anything about the project, which is obviously not what it was designed for. We have found projects signed with persons that were no longer recognized as the legal representatives of the reservation, but they were still signing a contract on behalf of the entire community. We have projects that bypassed the highest organs of internal governance of a community, projects that created or exacerbated conflicts. We have seen communities that were excluded altogether from a project, even though the land they inhabit was included in a project, which is sort of like a double exclusion, because they could not join in the benefits of the project, but they could neither seek another project to join, because obviously you can't have two environmental results in the same place. We have found communities with no access to project documents and no accountability to the way the revenue of projects is being distributed. All of these have led many of them to seek action in court. We have seen several communities taking these projects to court. One of them is already in the Constitutional Court, which is the country's Supreme Court, and which that obviously shows you there's a big problem. But second, we have also spotted several problems in specific actors of the carbon credit value chain. We have found auditors that are not visiting projects personally, but merely overflying them, and obviously, not being able to detect problems on the ground. We have found companies that appear as consultants to the project, but in reality are capitalist partners that are receiving part of the revenue that the project generates, unbeknownst to the communities that host the project. We have found one certifying standard that does not even publish project documents like the PDD or the auditor reports. Speaking about the transparency, as several have mentioned before me. We have seen a politician that was sanctioned for mismanagement and barred from holding public office, leading a carbon credit developing company and negotiating with indigenous communities, and obviously not telling them about his checkered past. We have seen a number of conflicts of interest. There's two that I think were very interesting. One was a developer who co-founded and was a shareholder of the auditor that was then hired to audit her own project. And another one was a company that was buying the first batches of credits of a project with a lot of problems, the one in the Supreme Court. But it was owned by the owners of the certifying company. So basically, these people were earning on two sides of the chain. We are also seeing buyers performing very little or no due diligence on the quality of the projects they were buying from. And all of this leads us to think that it isn't a question merely of bad apples. I think we see that this points to why there's more systemic flaws in the system. And I can mention a couple of the ones we noticed. We have spotted projects with problems in all 4 certifying standards operating for REDD+ projects in Colombia. We have seen there's no traceability of the credits, including who buys or resells them, just who cashes in on them. Obviously not how much they paid for them, and obviously not how much of the benefits reaches communities. We have found that even though it's their legal obligation, projects are not reporting how they uphold social and environmental standards, neither the Cancun safeguards nor the Colombian national interpretation of these safeguards that is much more detailed. And we have, of course, seen that the Colombian state is not filling the regulation gaps that we have been spotting. Everyone has been spotting. It is not overseeing the market, and it is not investigating possible irregularities that have been already identified. So I think in a nutshell, these problems show that we need more transparency, more accountability, and more civic society scrutiny, including, and I speak as a journalist, from journalism, to ensure that this very promising climate solution functions properly and it actually achieves its stated goals of helping local communities, perform these conservation efforts that we as countries need them to continue performing. And I think we need a lot more to get there. And this is what we have basically shown in our journalistic work.
Okay. Like a very critical position. I mean, and something that I would like to follow on this is that usually it's not something particular for carbon market, but like the negative news are the ones that are easily replicated, but not the positive ones. And from that point of view, and also going back to Andres to the point that like the media is taking on building confidence for carbon markets. What do you think that could be like the role of media to like a constructive discussion on carbon markets and how to improve like the confidence? And I think that Naomi also has a comment on this, maybe after Andres' response, please.
I think very shortly that most of the journalism that is looking at the carbon credit market is actually taking a proactive and optimistic approach to it. I think there's two, I think our responsibility is sort of dual. I think on the one hand, it is our responsibility to help shine a light on wherever there are problems. And whenever you have projects that have these problems, I think it is very important. It is timely. It is relevant for readers, for society, for citizens to know about it. So I think, we're not predestined to only look at bad things. I think part of it is in the way you look at things. I think the way we have been looking at this is a constructive approach, because we want this to work and we want this to work, these projects to work better. But whenever you find a project where the 90% of the community is not even aware of the existence of the project, and we found one in Colombia where almost 350,000 credits had already been cashed in by a US-based company, Chevron, while the community didn't even have an idea that a contract had been signed, much less that a project had been structured and validated and verified and certified. So I think whenever you have those problems, you really, a journalistic investigation is in place, just as any other civilian society, whether it's an academic approach or an NGO in the environmental field or in the indigenous affairs field looking at it. I think it's warranted. But I think, and this is the second point I wanted to make, how do we make sure this is a constructive approach? And I think the way we can ensure this is constructive is by acknowledging the potential of the climate finance mechanism and the climate solution. And we try to do this every single time. For us, it's very important to explain where these projects are located, why these forests are strategic, what ecosystem services do these ecosystems provide, what is the role that these local communities are, who are they, and why is it important that they continue performing this role? And obviously why it's important that such a mechanism as a carbon market works properly. This is our way of saying, we're not bashing this because we want to. We are just showing where there are problems, but we need to make this solution collectively work. But the way a lot of these projects are working right now is not, is deeply problematic, and that's not just what we think. It's what we are reporting with facts, and a lot of other people are pointing out. But I just wanted to say that I think we strive for being constructive, while at the same time continuing to perform our core mission of shining a light on where there are problems.
Okay, perfect. We have like a 12 minutes left, but before to jump into questions and answers from the audience, Naomi, please go ahead if you have any reactions or comments.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say, I think that the work that you, Andres, and other journalists are doing is really important here. And while I may not always agree with the conclusions found with every one of them, I think that, what you're finding on the ground are things that in any new market, when you have something that is brand new, it's going to go through issues that are unpredictable to some extent at the beginning. And I think that particularly when they scale rapidly, which is what we've seen over the last 3 years, it starts to attract actors who are seeing that scaling and who see the potential. And I think it requires increased diligence and increased oversight. And so I think that scrutiny is essential to the long-term success of this market. And
Vera is also working on all of these different elements. I mentioned transparency in terms of digitization and better data availability. We've also focused extensively on the audit process and some of the flaws within that, making sure that auditors have better training, particularly on the social side of things, which I think has lacked in some cases in the past, that there's better requirements for the oversight of that process. And we're also doing extensive work on updating our community and FPIC requirements. So we do take all of those issues seriously. And I think, this is a natural evolution of the market that to scrutinize, to find where there are issues and to really, double down on attempting to fix those so that we can continuously improve and ensure that this market is delivering not just on the GHG side, but with communities, which really is essential to the solution. I mean, in many cases, these projects really depend on that engagement to ensure that they actually even reduce emissions, let alone making sure that we're not having harm and that at the end of the day, there is in fact an additional benefit to those communities and to local economies.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much, Naomi. Okay, as we only have 10 minutes left, so I will now open the Q&A session. So Delcy, if you can also join us for this, that as well, like a couple of questions for you, please. Okay, so Dels, one of the question is why you don't use like the actual numbers of credits generated by projects to estimate the potential overclaiming of the projects, as you use is like the expected BCUs based on projects baseline? You're muted, please. You can you turn on your microphone? Okay, I think maybe it's like a technical issue if you can allow. Oh, okay. I think it's like a. Anna or Greg, maybe you can help me to turn off like a microphone.
Yeah, he's unable to turn on the microphone. I'm not sure why he's not being able to. Yeah, unmute.
Can you turn on, or maybe? Okay, sorry. I don't know if something happened. Maybe if you can answer, I'm gonna type the question and you can answer. I'm sure this was not made on purpose. Okay. Maybe we can go for another question. That is, I mean, and like a general question for all the audience. Do you consider, and that has been partly answered during your intervention, is do you consider that the synthetic control methodology proposed by TELS should we use it as a complementary methodological approach to the current methodologies for estimating carbon reduction from REDD projects? I think it's an open question for all the audience. So please go ahead. Please, Deborah.
I think it's a great idea to use it as a complementary approach. At Calyx Global, we think the more approaches, the better. We acknowledge that it's very hard to figure out what is going to happen in a given place. And we're all trying to figure that out. And the crediting depends on that counterfactual. So the more ways we can approach it, the better. And I think we're going to get to a point where as the methods improve, we're going to get a narrower band of what that future looks like. The other thing I want to make a point about is how valuable this approach is as a way to evaluate impact. So not just setting the baseline, but the impact, to have a relationship between the project and an area outside it, a control. You have a relationship. How did deforestation change outside? How did it change inside based on this project activity? It's a way to evaluate impact as well as to set the baseline. So I think it's harder than you think to determine whether or not deforestation has been reduced in a place. So having these synthetic controls is a way to estimate the impact of the project, not just to set the baseline. So I'm all for as many approaches as possible.
Perfect, thank you. Naomi, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that last point is important because the other side of that coin is what is an appropriate method for baseline setting versus what is an appropriate method as some sort of comparison or impact assessment. Because to use this to set a baseline is incredibly difficult because you're looking back at a number of points concurrently with the timeline of the project, whereas a baseline is a future-looking exercise. You have to set a baseline against which that crediting can occur in the future. And to do it the other way around causes a really, really challenging situation from a financial perspective. You know, you're just not going to get an investor into a project to do the design and implementation in a high quality way on the ground if they have no idea what kind of credit they're going to get out of that project. So there are realities to project finance and to project implementation and feasibility that also have to be taken into account. That said, I think, as I mentioned before, we are looking at whether this and how to construct something along this sort of method, when that could be appropriate and give a good comparison, and if that might be possible to compare going forward as a way of truing this up over time and informing in the future, better and better ways of predicting these baselines in the future. So I do think it's really interesting work. I think it can be refined and improved, and I think it may be an interesting comparison point. I don't think it in general makes sense in this sector to use as the baselining method itself, but we will see as we do more research on the comparative approaches what looks best going forward. Well, to be clear, we're not changing our methods again anytime soon.
Hey, totally understood. Thank you. Martin, please.
Yeah, I see two ways that the synthetic controls could be implemented in the context of the market. The first one, but I agree with Naomi that it's very hard to try to replace the current vision, contractual vision for this kind of baselines. But there is room also to create alternative tools and complementary tools to measure the additionality. It is possible to use this kind of approach in that way. And in any case, if we change the rules that we are implementing in the current voluntary carbon markets, and in consequence of this technical change, we will affect the quantity of funding that we are addressing to these local communities. I think any technical change also need to have into account adjustments in price or in benefit sharing model that try to compensate the impacts. But because at the end, all the intention of the carbon market is try to solve problem for the people that is living with the forest. So all the technical approaches that we took and implement to increase the quality also need to have the social aspect into account.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so we only have like 2 minutes left. I think this has been like a very valuable discussion, especially to have like some of the most relevant actors on the same panel. I really appreciate your interest for accepting like our invitation. I'm also aware that we are missing some key actors for the carbon market. I mean, for example, we're interested in like the project developers in the discussion, because at the end they are the one that decide what kind of methodology should you use, and also if they could complement or not with another ones. Okay, good to know that we have Tels back in the conversation. So
sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So did you follow my question?
I did. Yes, I did. I can answer it. It's actually, the answer is quite simple. So all the numbers that we report in the paper, they basically refer from the moment that the project was implemented until 2020, right? But not necessarily projects have been issuing credits all the way to 2020, because credits get issued every time there is a verification of the project, right? And that can happen every 5 years, for example, or every year. It varies. So we decided to look at the estimates that were available for every year, and those would had to be the ex-ante estimates. But that said, the work that the journalists from The Guardian did was actually based on the actual issued credits, right? So they looked at the ex-post estimates. That's their entire story is based on those numbers. So I mean, there you have it. You have the estimates based on the ex-ante credits from our study, and then you have the actual the ex-post estimates from the work from the Guardian journalists.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Tails. Okay, so thanks again. We are going to share like the recording of this webinar. I think that we are gonna ask for some of the attendance if it could be possible to share also like a Tails presentation. Just let me know if that is fine for you or not. Of course, and of course, like the final idea is to have like a constructive discussion on this. So we are very open like to continue working on this with all the panelists and also with all the attendants. And maybe like just a last comment is that I think it is important to don't forget like one of the principles from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it's the precautionary principle, no? I think that here we are facing like what kind of like a lack of scientific consensus on like effects on climate change, but now like on the effects of reduction from REDD projects. So I think it is not important to forget this and at the end like contribute from all the different actors to build like a confidence on the carbon markets. So thank you very much to all of you. Bye bye.